So, being somebody who is studying to become a biologist, who is also a creationist, I'm fairly often asked how I can maintain this position. Actually, often people don't ask; they just tell me what I'm thinking, and they're usually wrong. Um, Very often we are given this impression of the creation versus evolution controversy as you have the small minority of people on one side. So you have a handful of scientists on one side and the great academic universities of the world on the other side, and all of their faculty besides this one little sliver of people. And I don't think that's really an accurate description of what's going on. And of course, this is typically the picture that we're given, though, and it's constantly objected that since the creationist position and the intelligent design position are minority positions, they are therefore not valid. How can so many scientists on one side be wrong? And of course, all we need to do is look at the history we learned all through elementary school of the scientific community to see that that's not a valid objection. You have Galileo, you have Darwin, for crying out loud. You have a whole bunch of people throughout the history of the scientific community who've been laughed at, who've been ridiculed, who had their views who people objected to their views on philosophical grounds. And of course, people object to creation and object to intelligent design on the basis that they are perceived to interfere with their atheistic materialism. And since things are contradicting a materialistic worldview and the materialistic religion, it's objected that they are therefore not valid positions to take as a scientist. And of course, all this is saying is a clever way to say, if it doesn't conform to my religious beliefs, then it is therefore not science, which is what evolutionists are ultimately doing when they pull the card of, well, it's not materialistic. And it's like, for that matter, archaeology doesn't have a materialistic foundation, but it's still a good science. They infer design all the time in archaeology. Anyway, getting back on the topic, really, is this really a valid description of the scientific community, this idea that you have the major faculties and the major universities of the world on one side and only a handful of scientists on the other? And I don't think this is an accurate description of what's going on. I think in reality what you have is you have a handful of scientists who are creationists, a handful of scientists also who are intelligent design advocates, and you have a handful of scientists who are evolutionists who are actively debating them. And I think that if you were to look at each of these three groups, you who are actively involved in the creation-evolution controversy, you'd see pretty similar numbers. You might have a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen at most scientists who are actively engaged in this debate. Most scientists, on the other hand, I think are evolutionists by default. I think that most scientists have been told things like, well, evolution just means change over time. And then, of course, the textbooks will do a bait and switch and say, well, if you believe in change over time, then you have to believe that all life on Earth is related. Because they have several different definitions of evolution that are all lumped together. And of course, creationists accept that species change, we just don't accept the universal tree of life. But I think that the vast majority of scientists have been kind of the victims of a con game. And that might sound like a big thing to say, that might sound like a giant conspiracy theory, but I don't think it is. Most scientists who would be considered on paper to be evolutionists, they've been told things about creation that are simply false. They're told, well, creationists think that species don't change over time. And I think it's interesting. I was reading a testimony from Dr. John Sanford recently. Now, for those of you who don't know, he's the inventor of the gene gun, which is a device that has been used to genetically engineer about 70% of our genetically modified crops, if I remember correctly. So he's a very important scientist, and I've worked for him before. He's also a young Earth creationist. He spent most of his career, when he worked at Cornell, believing that evolution was true. And he says the reason he believed it is because he never considered to think any other way. It really wasn't a thinking. You really didn't perceive that there was any other way to think about things. And I think this is the way most scientists are, is they grow up and they're trained in the biological sciences for a very long time to think in evolutionary terms. And since they're trained to look at the world in one particular way, they're trained to see the world through one particular pair of glasses, they don't know of any way to think. Brilliant people, but I think that if more scientists looked at the creation arguments and looked at the intelligent design arguments for themselves, rather than the straw man arguments that they're given by the news media and by people like Ken Miller and Jerry Coyne and the National Center for Science Education, I think if they looked at the actual arguments that creationists and intelligent design advocates make, I don't think there'd be so many scientists who are quote-unquote evolutionists. So basically, I think that what has happened is there has just been kind of most scientists only know about creation and intelligent design through the grapevine. All they know about intelligent design, all they know about creation are the distortions they've heard from people who are hostile to creation and hostile to intelligent design. And I submit that if more scientists looked into the different viewpoints, that there wouldn't be this disproportionately large number of evolutionists. Like I said, I think most scientists are just evolutionists by default. They're evolutionists because this is basically how they've been told to think. And they've been given evidence here, they've been given arguments, and the arguments always sound good. But as Proverbs says, and yes, I'm bringing the Bible into this because even if you don't believe the Bible, I think this principle that it teaches is valid. Proverbs 18:17 says, "The first to present his case seems right until another comes forward and questions him." So you have one person that presents their argument, and it might sound like a really, really good argument. And it's like, how can you question that? This logic seems so sound, it seems so clear, and the evidence seems so strong. But then they're never allowed to see the other side. Scientists who might be their professors, who might object to evolution, might object to Darwinism, are fired from their jobs. So the next generation of scientists really doesn't get to hear the other side unless they investigate on their own. And it's pretty difficult to counter several years of evolutionary indoctrination when you're told for 4 years as an undergraduate, evolution is fact, evolution is proven true, etc. And that's what you were told all through high school. And generally, all through elementary and middle school. And this is what you've been told through your graduate program. And you're not really told, hey, take a look at what scientists on the other side of the fence have to say. Generally, it's just not going to happen, unfortunately. They might hear an argument here or there that might be an actual argument from ID and creationists. They might say, that sounds very interesting, and then they kind of move on with their day. And a lot of this is because college and graduate school are very time-consuming. So basically, I think that the reason that most scientists are most biologists are quote-unquote evolutionists is not because they have investigated creation and found wanting. It is that creation just hasn't been investigated, at least not the actual creation. They've been told things about creationists that just aren't true. They're told that creationists believe that species don't change, or told that creationists deny natural selection, things that are simply false. By the way, it was actually a creationist by the name of Edward Blyth who came up with the idea of natural selection. Most people don't know that. So, anyway, I think the bottom line, the reason most scientists are quote-unquote evolutionists, is just because, not necessarily by any fault of their own, but basically they just haven't taken the time to investigate and really hear the other side. And I'd like to leave off with a quote from Charles Darwin. A fair result can be obtained only by fully stating and balancing the facts and arguments on both sides of each question. Now, A lot of times creationists are accused of taking that quote out of context, but it's right there in Origin of Species. You can look it up for yourself and see this is exactly what Charles Darwin meant when it comes to creation versus evolution. And he was talking about creation versus evolution. So when it comes to creation versus evolution, the only way you can come to a fair conclusion, according to Darwin, is by looking at all the facts and all the arguments on all sides of each question. Now, I just want to clarify something I said earlier. I mentioned earlier about there being a handful of scientists who are creationists, a handful of scientists who are intelligent design advocates, and a handful of scientists who are evolutionists who are actively engaging in the debate. I think that might be, I wanted to clarify that it's actually, nobody knows how many creation scientists there are. But I do remember reading a number where they think there might be 10,000 in one region. And I think that might have been the United States alone, or one part of the United States. The bottom line is nobody knows for sure. When I say there's a handful of scientists actively engaged in the debate, I mean really in the public eye. I mean a handful of scientists working for places like Answers in Genesis, Institute for Creation Research, and with regards to the intelligent design people, it's a handful of people working for places like the Discovery Institute. And when it comes to evolution, it's a handful of scientists working on things like the National Center for Science Education and groups like this. So I think that with regards to those who are really very actively involved in the creation versus evolution debate, it's a handful in each group. But even creationists, you have tens of thousands of creationists, they're actively involved in research, whether it be in academia or in industry, or maybe some of them are retired, and they might be going off and doing something else. So it's not to say that there's only a few scientists who are creationists, because there's actually many, and there's many scientists who are intelligent design advocates, and they probably have an even larger number than the creationists. So to say that, to play the numbers game and say, well, this view is the mainstream and therefore it's correct, is quite misleading. It's simply wrong, and it's not a valid argument, and it doesn't make any sense to me why people continue to make this argument, because anybody who's in elementary school can see the fallacy of this, and I really have a hard time taking. Honestly, when I see people on the internet, especially commenting on this, I find it. Scientists should know better. If they make this argument, somebody who's on the internet, they should also know better. I assume that they at least have the ability to read and write since they're posting comments. So basically, this is not a valid argument, and I hope I'm not being too rude about this, but that's just the way it is. It's really not. It's not a good argument. It's not a smart argument. It's not an intelligent argument. However, if it might be a reason, I can see why somebody could have made the mistake. I can see why somebody would make the mistake if they weren't really thinking about it. Because anybody can be fooled by anything. It doesn't matter how smart they are. Every once in a while we hear an argument and we really don't think it through. So anyway, I think that just some basic critical thinking, basic logic, says that just because creationists are the minority doesn't mean that their viewpoint's not valid. Anyway, this is Greg, and thank you for taking the time to watch my video.